We were introduced to the throne room of God, and we went through and looked at a lot of the symbolic language. You all remember we broke into groups and we talked about that. Okay, so now in chapter 5, then we start getting an image of it starts setting up the seals, okay? And so chapter 5 says, "Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll with writing on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals." Okay, so that's going to be essentially setting up what we're going to be talking about tonight in chapter 6 through chapter 8, verse 5. And I also saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" Now, we all know that when we talk about seals, right, we're not talking about the animal. You know, we're talking about a wax that would be melted onto the scroll to keep it closed, and then they would seal it with a ring that would be like a signet ring and have like their icon or image on it, bearing the name of the person who wrote it. So that's what that was, and for whatever reason, this one has 7. All right, 7 obviously being a symbolic number of completeness. Okay, and I cried out and cried because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or even to look in it. Verse 5, "Then one of the elders said to me, 'Stop crying, look, stop crying. There's no crying in baseball. The lion from..." Thank you. The lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has been victorious so that he may open the scroll and its 7 seals. Then I saw one like a slaughtered lamb standing between the throne and the 4 living creatures, and among the elders. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent to all the earth. He came and took the scroll out of the right hand of the one seated on the throne. When he took the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp and gold bowls filled with incense, which are prayers of the saints, and they sang a new song. "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slaughtered and you redeemed people for God by your blood from every tribe and language and people and nation. You made them a kingdom and priests to our God." There we see the language of kingdom and priests again that we saw from chapter 1. "And they will reign on the earth." Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels around the throne, and also of the living creatures and of the elders. Their number was countless, thousands plus thousands of thousands. They said with a loud voice, "The Lamb who was slaughtered is worthy to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing." I heard every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, on the sea, and everything in them say, "Blessing and honor and glory and dominion to the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever." The 4 living creatures said, "Amen," and the elders fell down and worshipped. As far as some of the symbolic languages, the symbols that we saw in chapter 5, the right hand, the seal was in the right hand, which is the hand of ownership. All right, it's the position of power. It also has to deal with the position of judgment. And then in 5:3, under the earth, obviously that means death. 5:5, chapter 5, verse 5, from the lion from Judah, obviously is a reference to Genesis chapter 49, verse 9, which talks about Judah and the lion. It's a messianic passage. And along with that, the root of Jesse. Obviously, King David was the son of Jesse. So these are all like Old Testament references, essentially, that we get here in chapter 5 in this heavenly scene that reference things from the Old Testament, which is nothing new. We've been doing this for 4 chapters now. And so then we see the Lamb that was slain. First it was the lion, and then the lion turns into a lamb. Okay, and it has 7 horns, right? 7 eyes and 7 spirits. Now, the horns are a sign of authority and power. I think we talked about that last week in chapter 4. The 7 eyes references omniscience. He knows and sees everything. Then the 7 spirits, we've already been told, is the Holy Spirit. Chapter 5, verse 8, the creatures have a harp. What's funny is that we use this as a proof text to say that if the angels are using instruments, then it's okay for us to use instruments. I don't think that that's necessarily the same thing, but whatever floats your boat. So the golden bowls of incense, which we're told means the prayers of the saints, is going to come up again in chapters 6 and 7 as the martyrs lift up their prayers to the throne, asking for the torture to end. Let's see, is there anything else I really need to mention? No. There weren't as many complicated symbols in chapter 5. Does anybody have any questions about any of the images in chapter 5? That might be a better way to go through this than just me standing up here talking. But I kind of wanted to move on quickly through the listing of the symbols because what we see here is an interesting thing. So the lion appears and then becomes the lamb, and the lamb moves to the throne. All right, so there was movement there, and my question when I see that is, what are we watching here? What is the scene that we are witnessing? And when I put all of the elements together, at least in my head, and then I consulted some resources, this was an interesting concept that I found. So worship in Revelation chapter 4 through 5 is connected to war. Okay, so who is the one that is reigning? In antiquity, worship led to victory on the battlefield. The rest of Revelation unveils the judgments upon earth. The worship that we see here in Revelation chapter 4 through 5 are given to bring about the judgments / war against evil. It initiates the beginning of the end of evil's reign.
Well, it was kind of like the Lamb. God's wrath is going to happen on all of mankind, except that the Lamb comes and takes the reason for his wrath and takes it. Mm-hmm. To me, is kind of what I always thought. Like, God's wrath is going to happen to everyone. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen to the world. The time has come. But the Lamb comes and takes that scroll, all the wrath, and takes it upon himself.
Okay.
But this is not like Armageddon.
The worship here in chapter 4 through 5 is an initiation of I've got two things going on in my head. Is sort of an initiation of a war scene, all right? So if we think back to the Old Testament and the initiation of the war or the conquest of Canaan, okay, so what did they do to initiate their conquest of Canaan? Anybody remember? Can you recall?
River with the ark in front of them.
So they passed through the river.
The priest led them to Jericho.
Yep, and then they set up camp in Jericho, right?
Where's that? What book is that?
Joshua. And so it'd be the first 2 chapters of Joshua, right? So then God says, you're going to take Jericho, right? And what does God tell them to do in order to take Jericho?
March.
To march, right? And they march around the city how many times?
7.
All right, and then they blow their trumpets, right? And at the blowing of the trumpets, the walls come tumbling down. All right, so the marching and the blowing of the trumpets, all of that is a worship experience.
But it shook the wall.
Right?
So bad that they fell down.
Well, I don't think that's what happened, but this would be some pretty loud trumpets. So that was a worship scene that initiated a conquest or a war, an assault upon the people of Canaan. Okay, so I'm just using that as an illustration to show you that this sort of thing happens even in the Old Testament with the people of Israel. So they're always supposed to wait on Yahweh before they go into battle, into war, and they even carry the Ark of the Covenant in, right? All of this is just an illustration. Now, the fact that the Lamb moves from one place onto the throne, and we have this worship that's initiating the judgments or the war upon evil on earth. Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you. What I see here in chapters 4 through 5 is the glorification of Jesus. Right? It's his ascension scene. So what happens when he comes? When he leaves the earth, he goes up on the cloud, right? And the angels tell the disciples, "Why are you watching? He's going to come back the same way he came." All right. So this is like insert this story there, okay? Because this is what happens when he gets up there. He is ushered in as the conquering Lion of Judah, but he's the slain Lamb at the same time, and he takes his position of authority and power with God, and then begins the end, right? The end of days, I suppose. And we get this idea from Revelation 4 through 5 that when he sits down or takes his place next to God, Yahweh, then it's time for us to start wrapping up God's plan. And that means God's judgment upon evil. So, if we're going to talk about timeline, right, in this class, then what I see here in chapter 4 through 5 would be the year 30 A.D., give or take, right? So this is, and this is my take on the issue. There are a couple people who agree with me on this, or I agree with them. But this would be my position, is that what we see here in chapters 4 through 5 is Jesus has arrived into heaven, and he is taking his rightful position, and now the worship to initiate judgment has begun. And then what happens when you get to chapter 6? It's the judgment, right? Okay, so are we all on the same page?
Yeah, you changed my page, but that's okay. I'll leave it.
All right.
That's not what I
I had a bunch of discussion questions that I think I'm going to skip through. I do want to show this, though. All right, so at the end of chapter 5, we have come to the end of scene 3 of Act 1. All right, so if we think about this as a play, or something along those lines, then what we have here in Act 1 is essentially the introduction to everything else. So we've got 3 scenes. Scene 1 was, you better know who Jesus is. John, the author, blurs the lines between Jesus and the Father to emphasize Jesus' deity. Right? So we see Jesus in a way we've never seen him anywhere else in Scripture. In scene 2, chapters 2 through 3, you better get your church's business in order if you're going to survive impending persecution. That's essentially what those chapters are about. All right, so you've got Jesus, you've got the church, and now in scene 3, chapter 4 through 5, you better be worshiping with the reverence that God requires. Because if we don't have our hearts in the right place, then we won't endure the coming persecution or the trials that come with the end of time. So my particular position on when do the last days begin, or when does the end of days begin, however word you want to use there, the eschaton, whatever. The day that Jesus went back into heaven was the beginning of the last days. That is my position on the issue, and so that's, if you disagree, then Merry Christmas to you.
Well, it's a pretty standard.
Yeah. But because at any moment, right, we should expect Christ's return. So that means if we're to expect Christ's return, then we are in the final days. So, all right. Any questions? All right, so that was the end of that particular lesson. If you want, go ahead and answer those questions if you haven't already, those discussion questions, things that will just kind of make you think about worship and how we ought to handle that. Okay, so as far as the rest of tonight goes, then no longer need that. Just want to reiterate the main idea. Revelation is not a book about what will happen. It is a book about what happens, why it happens, and how Christians ought to respond when it does. This main idea is going to be bent, all right, in this particular lesson. Not broken, but it'll be bent.
As far as what happens.
So, and that's only because of seal number 6, okay? And I'll talk about it when we get there. Here's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to basically just walk through the 7 seals, tell you what I think about those things, and then there's some discussion questions along the way. We start with discussion questions, we end that with discussion questions. And there's a graph there on page 43 for you to fill in with your own notes. And then we'll talk about chapter 7, which is inserted into this in between seal 6 and seal 7, and talk about some application that we can draw from that, and then I'll get into my final thoughts. So we got an hour and 6 minutes. This ain't gonna happen, but we're not gonna get done. But yeah, I was gonna say we should be able to get done. My normal mantra every Monday night, but I'm just gonna be honest with you. If you all talk, we're not gonna get through it. So, but I encourage you to talk. I want you to talk. So I'm okay not getting all the way through it.
Just let you talk. You're doing good.
All right. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with our discussion questions then, which will help get our minds in I believe, the correct frame of mind for what we should expect from these seals, okay? So the Lamb is the one worthy to open the scroll. We learned that from chapter 5. He's the one who is worthy. The Lamb has gone to the one who sits on the throne and has taken the scroll from his hand. All of creation is praising the Lamb because he is worthy. Now the scroll is about to be opened, one seal at a time. The first 5 chapters of Revelation have been in preparation for the unveiling of this concealed scroll. Chapter 6 begins to reveal the things which must soon take place. All right, and on that note, let's begin with question numero uno. All right, so let's give some examples when there were periods of trials in history of the earth. So like difficult times in history when people suffered.
The Holocaust?
Yeah. And I don't know how to spell Holocaust.
You just do it phonetically, it won't believe you. Well, even the days of Noah, because Noah was left alone, starting out way back. And that was a period of trial because of all the evil around him. He was trying to live a holy life.
Yeah. Things we see today.
Slavery in Egypt.
Slavery. I always skip those 2 letters.
Oh, you had it right.
Oh, I did have it right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm always confused about those 2 letters. Which one goes where? All right, interesting word, factoid about Holocaust, since you mentioned it. Holocaust is from the Hebrew word, which sounds very similar, for burnt offering.
Oh, that's sick.
So this word is actually in the Old Testament.
When did they start calling it that,
I have no idea.
Wow.
So that's what the word literally means.
Well, they were
they were
Christians,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's
So-
why they call it that.
All right. What's something else? Maybe something more recently, other than the Holocaust.
Well, it's like the whole Roman Renaissance.
All right, slavery in America.
Well, all the genocides in Africa, all the Americans just getting wiped out. I mean, not Americans, but Christians.
How about all of the I don't want to say typhoon, that's not what they are. I can't even think.
The
all
tsunamis?
Yes, that we just
Natural
had.
disasters.
I mean,
Hurricanes.
Hurricane, that's it. I am so tired, my brain is not functioning.
War is going with the terrorists right now.
Yeah.
It really is.
Islam's fight against anything but Islam.
Yeah. All good things. Well, not good things. All good answers. Yeah. Oh, that was funny. Okay, so
Freudian slip.
yeah, when someone questions the existence of divinity, what do you tell them when they lob the question at you? If God is all good, all loving, and all powerful, then why do bad things happen to good people? Wouldn't God want to spare the people he loves from harm? Okay, so can I all right.
You gotta try and bring down.
Draw, yeah. Elaborate.
Well, because everything, like there's an outcome to everything you do. So it's like if we have free will to do anything, there's also consequences and stuff for that too.
Exactly. So if we have free will, then that means we have the option of walking out of God's will. And if we walk out of God's will, bad things happen, right? We have the fall because of that. Sin.
The original curse.
Yeah. So sin, the curse, just the fallenness. So why do we have free will?
I've asked many a times why he let us have free will.
Because he wanted us to choose it.
Yeah, you're right, but I still ask. Oh, if you hadn't given us free will.
Whoa.
I know.
So Benji is exactly right. So if he wants us to choose him and have a relationship with him, then we must truly love him. You cannot love God unless you have the option of not loving God. So he gave us free will.
But I don't give my 2-year-old free will.
No.
And I feel like
But
a
I'm
2-year-old
saying,
sometimes,
as a parent of
You give him the
adult
appearance
children,
of free will. You give him
you
options.
find
That's
that
what the law was.
that's kind of the same thing.
So this is always my go-to answer. There are other avenues to answer that particular question, but I find this is the strongest.
I go with we live in a fallen world
Yeah.
because of what Adam and Eve did. We're still paying the price.
Mm-hmm. So the little paragraph there on page 42, and then I have like this big blank spot, right? So stories of valiant martyrs are inspiring, but the reality of human suffering is a bit more grueling. The raw fact is that Christians are still being killed for their faith. Indeed, there have been more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than all others combined. In 1900, there were an estimated 35,000 martyrs, up to that point. Right. By 1991, it had increased to over 260,000. So I got those numbers from Mark Moore in his book, Dodging Dragons. There have been more than 10,000 Christians killed every year since 1950. Today, more than 25% of Christians around the world are part of an underground church. And one out of every 200 Christians living today can expect to die for their faith. And in over 180 countries, Christians have laid down their lives for their faith. Right? And I just send you back to the end of week 1 when I gave you that handout of where most of the persecution is coming from and what countries, because we certainly need to be praying for them. But here's my dilemma. Okay, so whenever we start talking about the seals and then the trumpets, and then the bowls, and all that stuff that's still yet to come in the book of Revelation. And when we want to try and put on a timeline when this quote-unquote great tribulation is supposed to occur, my question then is well, what about their suffering? Right? Does that not count as the great tribulation? Right? So if we want to talk about a tribulation in Revelation, right, and try and narrow down when this, with the main understanding is that it's a 7-year tribulation, right? Which, by the way, the words 7 and tribulation are never tied together in the book of Revelation. But when we try and figure out when this tribulation is going to occur, then we're more or less demeaning the deaths of all of these faithful since the time of Christ. So I think that to say something is a great tribulation is to deny them their respect, right? And I don't think that what John is getting at is that there's this one specific time at the end of history when there's going to be these 7 years and things are going to get really, really bad. When I look at these 7 seals, what I see is an unfolding cyclical pattern of Christians being persecuted and killed because of their faith, and it's just something that repeats itself all throughout time. So when we talk about cyclical, when I use that word, do we all know what I'm talking about, right? So you've got event A, and then B, C, D, E, right? So A kind of initiates something, and it goes around into a circle until it comes back full circle, and it just kind of repeats itself. Right. So this is also, by the way, how Jews understand time. So it's a circular pattern. Another example would be like the Judges. Right.
So keep going back to.
So you've got they sin, they're put into slavery, they pray or supplication for God to deliver them. He sends them a savior or a judge, and so that was a continuous, repetitious pattern. So what we have in Revelation is the same understanding. Okay, so we've got, instead of judges or prophecy or whatever, we've got seals, we've got trumpets, and we've got bowls. Okay, and they're not like exactly the same thing every time we go around the circle, but essentially what it is it's a repetition of the same story of God judging the world. Okay, so what we get when we start going into chapter 6, really until we get to chapter 16, so the rest of Act 2 of Revelation, the seals will give a judgment, and you see a conclusion in seal 6 and seal 7. But seal 7 opens up to the trumpets, right? And the trumpets come around, and they give their 7 trumpets, and then that last one opens up to the bowls, right? And then the bowls go around. And so you get the same thing over and over and over again. The way that the video demonstrated was the Russian nesting dolls. So you open up one, and there's another one. You open up another one, and there's another one. So what we have in chapters 6 through 16 is this repeating of the same thing essentially over and over and over again. It's telling the same story, but from a different vantage point.
So not necessarily in different time periods.
No.
Yeah, and that's the way we've kind of been banged into thinking, different time periods.
Right.
But you're saying that it's just through a different lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a different perspective on God's judgments.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is essentially what we're going with, right? And now we get to the first round, the circle, which are the 7 seals. So let's begin with this funness, right? All right.
Number 1.
So I'm just going to read through the text. You can follow along. You can fill it in the graph right there on the next page, page 43. I tried to give you as much space as possible, but I didn't want to go on to another page, so if it's not enough, you've got this huge blank spot right here for you to take notes. Okay, so chapter 6, verse 1. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a loud voice like thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there was a white horse. The horseman on it had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he went out as a victor to conquer. Okay, so what is the first seal? What?
White horse.
Huh?
White horse.
Yeah, it's the white horse, right? And the horseman that rode on him. So you've got this picture of a white horse. The horseman on it had a bow. Okay. So that would be the seal. So what does this mean, right?
That kind of bow?
Yes.
Not a tied up one?
No.
Okay.
Not like you would put on a car, or like a new car, or a present of some kind. All right. So what does this white horseman represent? Well, the first option is Christ. You didn't think I was going to mention that, did you? All right. But where else do we see a white rider? Right? In chapter 19, if you've been doing your reading, you've got the person dressed in white. His robe was dipped in blood, and he mounts his horse, and he comes and he conquers the kings of the world. So the other time in Revelation when we see a white horseman, it clearly is Christ. Then another option, another idea as to what it could be is a satanic being. Okay, this is probably the more go-to, or one of the more go-tos at least. So this person, whoever he is a conquering king of some kind. And we see the word conquering also appearing in chapter 11, verse 7, and 13, verse 7, and that's done by the beast, right, in chapter 13. So this person could be like someone like the beast of chapter 13. In Revelation 12 through 13, we see Satan imitates Christ. So if he's going to imitate Christ, he would want to dress in white and be regal looking, kind of like Christ looks like in chapter 19. That would be option 2. Option 3, which is probably what I would go with, is that it could be any king, any particular ruler throughout time trying to conquer others, right? So essentially what they're doing is more or less introducing war. So here's where we need to really consider like Rome and Babylon, Alexander the Great, the Persians, right? So the writer is under the rule of God, but Paul tells us in Romans that all the leaders of government are ordained by God. So this would be a judgment from God because free will people by nature hate tyrannical leaders. Okay, so God would be sending someone like an Alexander the Great or a Hitler, a Mussolini, somebody like that kind of figure, because one, it oppresses people, which is a judgment from God upon the people of the earth, and because we have free will and we want freedom, eventually all tyrannical people, all their reigns come to a pretty dramatic end at some point, at least all the major ones.
And it also brings people running to God sometimes because of that pressure that a person, the gospel flourishes in that.
It can.
So,
it can. A lot of times it does.
Yeah.
So I would go with that this person in white is some sort of leader, some national leader who is engaging in a conquest upon the rest of the world. Their initial setting would obviously be Domitian, Caesar Domitian, the reigning Caesar of their day. Domitan.
It's his name.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were using it as a word
Oh, no.
I didn't know what it
That
meant.
was the name of the Caesar in the time that John wrote
okay, I'm sorry.
the book of Revelation.
I'm sorry, I keep having stupid outbursts. I don't know.
Hey, you're fine. So there are some other issues that we should address, and we're going to, but when we're done going through all these, we're going to look at Zechariah 1, 8 through 15, and Zechariah 6, 8 through 12. And there we also see a horse and rider and 4 chariots that kind of look similar to the horsemen of the apocalypse, right? And what's important to understand is that this rider, whoever he is under the control of God. All right, the second seal. So when he opened the second seal, verse 3, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse went out, a fiery red one, and its horseman was empowered to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And a large sword was given to him. Okay, so what's the second seal?
Red horse.
All right, the fiery red horse, and the person on it would take peace from the earth. So there's 2 possibilities as to what this could mean, at least what I found in my research. But both of them kind of fall under a major umbrella. So the second rider rides forth in direct response to the angelic command. He is inflicting an international strife of some kind. So the first option is that it's the persecution of believers, right? So this fiery red horse is sent out to persecute believers in Christ. The word there for slaughter one another, which is every other time it's used in the book of Revelation, it is used to refer to Christ's believers. So believers in him being killed and slaughtered. And those, if you wanted to look those up, you'd be in chapter 5, verse 6, verse 9, verse 12, chapter 6, verse 9, 13, chapter 13, verse 8, and chapter 18, verse 24. So those are the other times when we see the word slaughter. The other option, rather than just persecution of believers, again, my favorite option will always come last, is that it's just basically war in general, okay? War in general. So the phrase slay one another or slaughter one another would make one think of war rather than persecution of believers. War would be a judgment from God because the unrighteous are caught up in it. Everyone is impacted by war, right? So
World War III.
well, all right. So World War I, World War II are examples of the entire, most of the world being engaged in some conflict where millions of people were killed. So that would be a punishment, more or less, upon God or by God, because He's allowing this first horseman to engage in a war, and that war leads to the killing of people. The third seal. Verse 5, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and there was a black horse. The horseman on it had a set of scales in his hand. And then I heard something like a voice among the 4 living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. But do not harm the olive and the wine." We got to protect our wine. See, God protected wine. Just making a joke. All right, so here's there's really only one possibility because it's so clear, and that is famine. All right, so this third horseman is famine, the black horse. So famine, metaphorically represented by scales in the rider's hand in the ancient world. Food was distributed by ration amounts using scales when it became scarce. So, if there was a famine, they would measure out the proper amount of food for this person, for that. So they would use one weight, and then they would measure everybody. So they made sure that everybody got the same amount of food. it- So a denarius was a day's wage, right? So the command that comes with this. A denarius was a day's wage, and a quart of wheat was about enough for one person for one day to live on. Although 3 quarts of barley was enough for 3 days for the typical family for one day. So basically what we see here is that the prices listed here are about anywhere from 8 to 16 times the average price that it would have been in that day during the Roman period. So therefore, those suffering from the famine will only be able to buy limited food quantities for their family, and there will be nothing left over to provide for any of the other necessities of life.
Barley was like a poor man's grain also in the New Testament, whereas wheat wasn't. So was it maybe because barley was more prevalent? Maybe it was why it's 3 instead of 1?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Here's an interesting factoid. And I love your little giggle. It gets me every time. In AD 92, Caesar Domitian made an edict ordering half of the vineyards in Asia Minor to be destroyed. So this could be standing in the background of this particular horse, right? So God gave the command, protect the wine, right? And so here he is saying, we're going to protect the wine when you've got the earthly king destroying it. Possible connection there. The 4th seal. When he opened, verse 7, when he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. The horseman on it was named Death, and Hades was following after him. Authority was given to him over 1/4 of the earth to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and by the wild animals of the earth. So basically the 4th seal is death. All right, so we know what that one is. Yeah, it tells us as much. And this is the only time where it's actually like clearly telling us that this is, the name is death.
Well, death is pretty cut and dried.
Yeah. So Hades is the sphere that imprisons the dead. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses death and Hades in combination almost synonymously in reference to the region of the dead. Right? So the writer may summarize the previous 3 or is the result of the previous 3. So we're now in seal 4, all right, and then we've got death, the 4th horseman, and Hades follows after him, right? So I kind of want to pause for a moment and see, is there a logical progression to these 4 horsemen, or are they all given at the same time? Or, okay, so we've got 4 horses, 4 riders. Okay, so let me draw a horse.
Oh, don't. Just say it is.
Alright, so anyways, there's the head.
Cute. Dudley Do Right's horse.
It's got
That's his name.
Oh, I don't remember.
So anyways, now that you're done making fun of my horse,
He's quite cute,
It
actually.
looked good to me, better than I could do.
thank you.
You're continuing.
Okay, so anyways, we got 4 of these things. We've got, where are they? We got white, right, and that is the king. Then we've got red, and that is war. Okay, and then we got green, or no, black.
Black.
Yeah, black,
Dead.
and that's famine.
Famine.
All right, and then we've got the green.
Pale green. I've never seen a pale green horse. Have you?
Mine doesn't say green, mine
It just says pale. Yeah. I don't know where you're getting green. One says green.
Oh, ashen, that would be green.
Ashen. Kind of.
Mine says ashen.
Yeah.
Sickly green, like you're a sickly pale green.
Yeah,
Okay. Maybe.
So anyways,
ashen.
pale green, and that is death. Okay, so is there a logical progression to these things? Let me put down my...
Well, not if it's cyclic, like we were talking about. They're all happening all at the same time, all through since Christ went up in the beginning of the end times.
Mm-hmm.
Which is true. All of that has been happening.
Yeah.
All through history.
Mm-hmm. So it is kind of repetitious of some kind. Let me propose this, right? You heard me say at some point in this series that Revelation is a template of what happens, right? You can lay it over any particular time period, and that you can start seeing how it lines up in history, right? So let's go with perhaps a modern experience, okay? And I'm just doing that. I'm not trying to make any sort of political statement. I'm just saying more or less what is, okay? So you've got a white king who is bent on conquering perhaps another people, right? So you could say after 9/11, okay? We were bent on conquering Iraq and Afghanistan. Regardless of motives, remove your passion from this particular discussion. All right? The next thing is war. So obviously, we went to war. Now, what happened in that war? We bombed the heck out of Afghanistan and Iraq. Right? You know what happens when you bomb people?
Innocence.
You destroy their infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? You destroy their roads, which, they didn't really have very good ones to begin with. And so you can no longer move goods. And so there's a shortage of food. Did you know that one of the things we did...
Now. Right.
What?
That's why they're all refugees now.
Well, that's in Syria.
Yeah, that's not bad.
But that is the result of a war in Syria, right? So the shortage, there was a shortage of food, and the United States dropped food to the people. And in those packages of food, as the planes, they would put notes in them that would say, U.S. is your friend, to try and make allies with the people on the ground. Right? So we had to provide food because there was a lack of food, because we destroyed their infrastructure. What happens when you've got war and a shortage of food? People die. So, do these four horsemen tell us a future event that these are actual four horsemen, or do they tell us simply what happens when you have leaders trying to conquer other people? And perhaps that's a false dichotomy. Maybe there is more than one option here. But
is there any significance to where it says that they're each given power over a fourth of the earth? What is that?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, but the fact that there's four of them and they're even each given a fourth, meaning that from all four of them, they've impacted the entire world, right, in some way. Because remember, if you list, you count. So we got four, and they're sent to the earth, and so this is impacting the entire earth. 4 is the number of creation. So remember, we talked about that. So here's what I see. I see this, right? Because all throughout time, you've got people trying to figure out who are these different horsemen, or all this stuff, or when are they coming, and that kind of thing. And what I see is, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Nero, Hitler, Mussolini, right? So you've got these people who try to conquer the world in some way, and because of that, people die.
There's always results.
Yeah.
Consequences, like you said in the beginning, consequences of free will.
So that's my thoughts on the four horsemen. see if there's anything else I need to mention. And the fourth one, I mean, there is kind of a pattern to it, right? So this guy introduces more or less what's going to happen because he's the initiator. But this guy wraps up everything that has happened, that looks back onto them. So some people will tell you that these four things are all sent out at the exact same time and that there's not any sort of progression of events behind them. But when I see them, I clearly see this is what happens when you have people conquering people.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. So we encounter perhaps a theological problem. I mean, if you want to look at it that way. Some people might. But so how can God be the author of so much horror and evilness and death? Because each one of these four horsemen are commanded by God to go and do what they do. So how can a loving God send these four creatures, these four horsemen, out upon the earth? That was not a rhetorical question, if anybody wants to answer.
Well, he's also the perfect judge. He's the one who knows the hearts of every man, and he's perfect, and so I will trust him with all the innocent people who died during all this. I will trust him with their lives, because he's the perfect judge. And I don't know how else to rationalize that other than he's perfect, he knows everyone's hearts, and when innocents die, he will take care of that.
Yeah. And let's go right into the fifth seal off of that. All right. So in verse 9, chapter 6, verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the people slaughtered because of God's word and the testimony they had. They cried out with a loud voice, Lord, the one who is holy and true, how long until you judge and avenge our blood from those who live on the earth? So a white robe was given to each of them, and they were told to rest a little while longer until the number would be completed of their fellow slaves and their brothers who were going to be killed just as they had been. Okay, so what we see here in the fifth seal would be the martyrs, right? The people who were slaughtered. And they are being told to rest a little while longer. Wait on God's judgment a little while longer. So this is an appeal to God by persecuted and glorified Christians to demonstrate his justice by judging their persecutors, that they will be answered when all his people complete the suffering that he has determined for them. So Seal 5, in short, is the human response, the Christian, the martyr's response to these four things.
And that God hears.
Yeah, and that God hears.
He knows.
And so, you've got you've got somebody attacking someone else. They go to war. There's a shortage of food. People die. So as you mentioned, you have innocents who die through this. Those innocents will include believers. And because they have endured into the end in their faith, they are granted position in God's throne room, and in there they cry out to him, Lord, how much longer must I wait for the righteousness of God, for your judgment to come upon the earth? And he tells them to wait.
His time, not ours.
Yeah, which I can't imagine how hard it must be to tell somebody who's suffering in their pain that they have to endure in that. Right? Now, in the seal, it's those who have been killed, those who have been martyred. But that could represent all people, all Christians who are experiencing some sort of persecution, right? So we have to remember this is a symbol. This is not a literal reading, right, of the text. And so what this could mean is that God hears our prayers, or the prayers of those Christians who are in the underground church, those who are being persecuted, and they're asking God in their prayers, how much longer must we wait? How long must we endure? And God's response is, you have to continue. You have to endure. How painful, how hard do you think it is to tell somebody who's suffering that they have to keep suffering?
But when I read like the Voice of the Martyrs, almost always they say things like, when they're interviewing them, say things like, how worthy is it for me to suffer like my Christ did? Or they don't seem to dwell on that as bad.
Yeah.
They seem to expect that trial, that persecution, and know that it's only for a short time when this life ends.
Yeah. Read
that magazine, The Voice of the Martyrs. It's a free publication.
Yeah.
You can get it online.
Yeah, it's very good. So let's set this in the world of the first century, right? So you've got Domitian, who is expanding the persecution against Christians and is now impacting Asia Minor, where those 7 churches are, and they've been prepped and told in the first 5 chapters that they need to be ready because persecution is coming. And you have an emperor who is all about spreading his reign throughout the entire world, and because of his war, people are dying. Shortage of food, all of this, taking food from other places of the empire to feed his legions, right? And people are dying. And so this message, I believe, is just as much impacting the direct situation that those 7 churches are in. They are experiencing these things constantly in the world of being in an empire. And so they see the Caesar, they see the wars, they see the shortage of food, and they see the innocent people dying. And, we already know from 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that his community is fracturing. And yet here they're being told to continue to wait. It would be difficult. And I know those who are experiencing persecution, a lot of them, right, with the privilege that they have, that they're going through it. Certainly not all Christians who are persecuted experience that. Those who endure, I think, reach that level of maturity in their faith. But if they do not endure, then what happens? Right? So they turn, their community fractures, and you've got people, the community of the church breaks.
You're not an overcomer.
Huh?
You're not an overcomer if you turn away.
Exactly, right? And this is more or less John's message in this 5th seal. You have to endure. All right, so let's see if there's anything else I need to mention here. Some interesting little things, I suppose. The mention of the altar here in association with those slain evokes the sacrificial nature of the suffering, right? So whenever you hear altar, your mind automatically goes to the temple and the altar and that sort of thing. But I would tell you...
What is the altar if they're under the altar?
Huh?
It says they're under the altar.
Right.
So what would the altar be?
That's an excellent question. All right. So it's not necessarily the big stone altar where they would slaughter the animals, but it is probably referring to the golden altar of incense, which stood in the vicinity of the Holy of Holies inside the temple. So the sacrificial blood of the Day of Atonement was poured on this altar, and incense was burned on it. And they would loft the incense into the Holy of Holies. So you've got this temple imagery of this golden altar of incense, which was literally an incense, and you have the prayers of the martyrs like an incense being lofted up to God. So that's probably where I would say John's getting this particular imagery from. That's all I need to say about the 5th seal. Are there any questions up to this point? No? All right, we're moving right along. 6th seal. Then I saw, verse 12, then I saw him open the sixth seal. A violent earthquake occurred. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The entire moon became like blood. The stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its unripe figs when shaken by a high wind. The sky separated like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the nobles of the military commanders, the rich, the powerful, and every slave and free person hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, because the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Okay, this seal is intense. All right, there's lots of imagery and lots of things going on. And remember how I said Revelation doesn't tell us what will happen; it tells us what happens and what always happens. Okay, and I said it was going to bend. Okay, so this is where the bending begins. Okay, so remember Revelation 4 and 5. I said was the scene in heaven when Jesus ascended into it and he took his position of authority. All right, so that would be the beginning of the end. All right, seal 6 would be our first picture of the end of the world. All right, so this is the first time we see the end of the world. So this reference is to the final judgment of God upon the earth and unbelievers, not upon Christians.
Whoa.
That was a text message from Todd Myers. So
Okay, say that again. The end of the world.
yeah, so this references the final judgment of God upon the earth and unbelievers. Period. Not, well, at least what's here is not upon Christians. This is one possibility. This is the second, more or less, when the second coming of Christ would be. Everything is over at this point. That's one possibility, that it's the end of the world.
That must not be what you believe because you didn't see that.
Wait a minute, okay.
I will give more credence to that particular view than I would the others. I'm okay saying that Seal 6 is the end of the world because of the imagery that we get here. However, I do think that there is maybe another option. All right, in that this is the humbling judgment of the men responsible for the 4 horsemen of the war. All right, so
The 4 men responsible.
yeah, these would be the people responsible for the 4 horsemen, like the conquering king, the one who brought the war and the famine and death to the people. So Seal 6 would be the judgment upon those people. So like
Throughout history, the different cycles of these people. Is that
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So like in World War II, it would be the Allied powers, right? Or the Allies. And they defeated the Axis powers, right? So we would be the ones who brought judgment upon those who tried to conquer the world. That would be an example. All right, and here's why that I would say that is because I've already demonstrated how these things repeat themselves in history, and then in chapter 6, in Seal 6. In Seal 5, you have the Christians asking, how long must we endure this suffering? And then in Seal 6, we're told that this is when the suffering ends. These things happen. So it could be the end of the world. I'm okay with saying that. It could be both. It could be like a culminating event where it happens throughout time, but there's a final fulfillment of it, the destruction of the world.
When it talks about all the stars falling to earth, though,
Right.
man, that's the end.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how it couldn't be.
And all the land and.
Was it saying they fall to the earth like figs fall or something like that. I mean,
Yeah. So
that's pretty much a destroying.
yeah. There's no question. The language here is that of total destruction of the earth, right?
Yeah.
But
That has to happen before you get a new earth and heaven.
That's true. So, which is why I'm okay with saying that. And here's why it could be both, right? Because we know that from the coin. Remember that I showed you the coin, and it had the son of Domitian sitting on top of the world, and there were 7 stars scattered above his head, right? So that is a sign of divine and presence, and those things come crashing down to the world. So the leader, this great leader, the first horseman, his world more or less collapses under the weight of God's judgment. His tyrannical rule is taken away. So if you want to go with a more symbolic reading of Revelation, I would go that particular route. It's the end of these horses. And the end to seal 5, it'd be the end of the Christians or the people who are suffering amidst all of this.
Which is the end time then, isn't it? If all the Christians are done suffering, if this is the time when God said, wait until all your fellow brethren are slain, well, couldn't that be this time now? All the brethren have been slain, and so this is the end.
It could
So
be.
He said wait.
He said wait until all of the Christian, until, what's the wording?
Well, to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers were to be killed as they had been was completed.
Right.
That kind of thing.
So here's where we have to battle in our minds, all right? Is this a picture of what happens, or is this a picture of the end of the world? Could those two things be the same? Right? Here's my take, all right? That these 4 things happen all throughout time. Okay? During war, innocent people die. When the war is over, the innocent people stop dying.
Not really.
Well, as the result of these things, right?
There has to be an end time for there to be a new heaven and a new earth.
There does.
And there has to be an
Yes.
end time.
Yes, there does. And I'm okay with saying that, all right? So you have to remember.
Either way, I agree. Yeah.
These things keep coming back and back and back around, right? So eventually, this thing will happen. The world will be remade.
Well, where's the Christians at that point then? The believers?
All been killed.
They in spaceships?
Heaven.
Hanging out?
They're
Or
all in heaven that had already been murdered.
ark?
There ain't no spaceships.
Well,
We're in
that's what
heaven.
the ponytail guy said.
Here's
Have you ever watched Ancient Aliens?
Oh my.
Yeah, I'm getting that.
I guess my understanding would be that. See, that was my problem too when I was reading this. Is where are the rest of the Christians in all of this? And there's no mention of the return of Christ in particular in this particular passage, which there doesn't necessarily have to be. He's focusing on the judgment. I get that. But the question is where are all the believers? Where are the people who are left? Because if you notice in the people that he mentions, all right. So in verse 15. You've got, then the kings of the earth, the nobles, the military commanders, the rich, the powerful, and every slave and free person hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. It's a list of 7 groups of people. Okay? These 7. I said, I'm sorry. The poor, right? Or not the poor, the slave and free person. I didn't put my finger up.
If the mountains were removed.
Yeah. You're right. Hang on a second. Bear with me for a minute. All right. So you've got a list of seven things. All right. Which 7 is the number of
Completeness.
All right, it's a symbolic number. It tells us we're reading imagery here. Right? It's a symbol of some kind. Notice who's not mentioned there. We have no mention of poor people. We have no mention of believers. All right? And who are mentioned? Kings of the earth. You've got the nobles and military commanders, people who would institute the war. You've got the rich and powerful and every slave and free person who would, more or less be the cause of the famine.
Poor, I mean, a slave and a poor person's kind of the same.
Yeah, but it said rich. Yeah, it could be. You're right.
The rabble is what's left. The rabble is what's left. Non-believers. Because they're trying to hide from the land.
From the judgment.
Yeah, if
right?
they were Christians, they wouldn't be trying to hide.
So.
I think they've already met him.
No.
Did you see it? Did you go and watch it? Oh,
so.
Yeah, I did.
The kind of people that are mentioned here are the kinds of people that would be the result of this. All right? And so those are the people who are suffering this judgment. Okay? And then let's also look at verse 13 through 14. I'm sorry, let's go back. Verse 12. Then I saw him open the sixth seal. A violent earthquake occurred. All right? So you got violent earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The entire moon became like blood. The stars of heaven fell to the earth as fig trees drops its unripe figs when shaken by the wind. The sky separated like a scroll being rolled up. And if anyone ever tells you that's an atomic warhead, you're supposed to smack them at that point.
We don't smack nobody.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That's assault. You go to jail for assault.
And every mountain and island was moved from its place. We have a listing of 7 things.
So complete destruction of the world.
Okay. Possibilities. The reference to the final judgment of God and the earth and unbelievers, not upon Christians, I already mentioned that, or the humbling judgment of men responsible for the 4 horsemen of the war. I would go with the latter, but I would include both of them, okay, in this particular one. But in response to the sequence of seals, it makes more sense to me that seal 6 is the end of the reign of the 4 horsemen. It's the end of the suffering Christians. Okay, remember, this is all symbols. It doesn't have to fit neatly into some sort of pattern of some kind. All right, so there's a sequence of 7 of creation items. We already mentioned that. 7 groups of people judged. All right, so you mentioned, so how can, all right, they hide in mountains and stuff if they've all been demolished, right? Well, don't do that. Okay. So, the earth dwellers appeal desperately to the mountains and the rocks. Fall on us and hide us. All right. So this petition alludes to Hosea chapter 10, verse 8, which, like Isaiah chapter 2, speaks of judgment on idolaters and portrays them seeking refuge from divine wrath in mountains and rocks. This is what it says. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. This is Old Testament. There's similar imagery in Jeremiah 4:29, which is also included in the allusion, which enforces further the idea of judgment on idolaters who try to hide from God's anger. Interesting note, pagans were referring to their idols as to their mountains and their rocks. So these 7 groups of people are calling out to their idols to protect them from God.
What was the reference in Hosea?
Yeah.
Hosea chapter 10, verse 8.
And Isaiah.
Is it Jeremiah?
Isaiah 2, the whole chapter. And then there was Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 29.
Which brings us to the 7th seal.
So the question there at the end is, who is able to stand? That's what chapter 7 is all about, which looks like we'll probably get into next week. The 7th seal, when he opened, we'll finish tonight. I'll get through it. So when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand in the presence of God. 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel with a gold incense burner came and stood at the altar. He was given a large amount of incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the gold altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up in the presence of God from angel's hand. The angel took the incense burner, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it to the earth. There were rumblings of thunder, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. All right, so this begins, the seventh seal begins the 7 trumpets. Okay, so that's where it goes to in verse 6. Essentially, the 7th seal is silence. Silence in heaven. And that's basically all we know about the 7th seal. We don't quite understand this one.
Well, it kind of makes sense in that if the end of the world had happened and there was all the crashing and total destruction.
Yeah.
There needs to be silence after all that.
Yeah, like a moment of silence, that kind of like how we have like a moment of silence.
Well, and just in honor and worship of God.
Yeah.
The one who did it.
Even think like after a huge, large, loud, crashing thunderstorm, and then there's silence after that.
Tell me again, what'd you say the 7th seal was?
Silence.
Silence in
heaven.
It's not listed as the 7th seal. It's
We're reading that chapter 7 and like verse.
Oh, we're in chapter 8. In order to get to the 7th seal, you have to jump over chapter 7 and get to chapter 8.
It's written sideways. I can't do sideways.
The 7th seal of the golden scepter, or censer.
What?
Censer. C-E-N-C-S-E.
So 8:1, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half hour.
Okay. So what is the seal that he opened in verse 2 of 7, when it says, I saw another angel coming from the east and having the seal of the living God? Was that part of the seal 7, or is that something totally different?
I read and had that question too, and I don't know.
Maybe there's supposed to be 8.
Maybe. My impression was that it was the seal. It was a continuation of the 6th or the 5th seal, something along those lines. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
So
we don't know.
Yeah, and you know how I don't like to say I don't know something.
Well,
All right, really quickly, we're going to go through chapter 7 and the application that we get. All right, so remember at the end of seal 5, you have the prayer of the martyrs, and the question presented at the end is, you must wait a little longer. Okay.
Sorry. Oh, I can see.
And then at the end of the 6th seal, the question posed was, who can endure? Who can stand against this? Or who can stand and endure it? Right? The answer to that question is all of chapter 7. We're in the thick of Revelation now. All right? There's no more introductory stuff. We're talking about how life happens to Christians, what they ought to do and look like in response to that. Chapter 7 is the first time we get into that. Right, and then we're just continuing this stuff because we'll get into the 7 trumpets next week. So this is when life gets very confusing. I cut out a lot of the remaining conversation that we had because there were some prayer requests and a bit of confusion over where we were at in the lesson. So I just kind of cut all that out, and we're going to come back to all of that in next week's lesson anyway. So we stopped this particular lesson with the 7th seal, and next week when we come back we'll open up our time investigating chapter 7 of Revelation, and then we'll skip over the seventh seal, verses 8, or chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, and go to verse 6, and go to the seven trumpets. Thank you.